2.0. Or how to realize that 20th century evolutionists don't even understand Darwin. First of all, we need to get the big picture. There are just two things that make up the universe. Number 1, matter. I would hope most folks would realize that we are part of a galaxy which has a few billion stars in it, and our galaxy is one of several billion galaxies in the universe. Big concept, but how about this? They are all made of matter, much as the Earth is made of matter. Think, periodic table. When you look at the image of our galaxy, you see one other thing that is important, number 2. And that is light or energy. That is what the galaxy and the universe is made out of. But when you hold up your hand, when you look in the mirror, there is one other thing that is also important. And that would be information. Or, intelligence, thought, reason, and so on. Now I'm going to start this by using a bit of scripture. In the beginning was the Word. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning, through all things were made. As we get into this discussion of Evolution 2.0, we are going to find out that the word has a much more profound meaning than you might think. Now I recommend going to Evolution 2.0, and I would recommend looking at pages 50 and 51, which excerpts a comment from Watson, of the team Watson and Crick, who discovered the chemical structure of DNA in 1953. DNA, which is the word and is in every living cell in your body. When Watson and Crick were having lunch at the Eagle, a favorite pub of theirs located in Cambridge, England. This is when Crick bragged, "We have discovered the secret of life." He was referring to the fact that they had discovered the solution to two of biology's oldest mysteries, how hereditary information, in reproducing biosystems, is stored and how it is replicated. Now this is factual, and the fact is important. However, Watson, not Crick, goes on to say, "Our discovery put an end to a debate as old as modern science and even the human species. This is, does life have some magical, mystical essence, or is it merely like any chemical process carried out in scientific work or in the classroom or the lab? Is there something divine at the heart of a cell that brings it to life?" Watson, arrogant and incomplete and stupid answer, is, the double helix answers that question with definitive no. We need to start with this, and then discuss the utility of a computer, let's say PC, which has no programs in it, and no operating system in it. In point of fact, let's look at this. Notice the difference between the PC hardware and the software. To make use of the hardware, we need two pieces of information. And please note, the information is fundamentally in the form of words, as what God was from the beginning. To make a start on deciding how biology really works, and also makes changes necessary to survive and build, we have to discuss what the evolutionary biologists are claiming, and then explain why their concept cannot work without the word. To do this, Perry Marshall defines some terms, from the Darwinist perspective. Natural selection, a natural process that results in the survival and reproductive success of individuals or groups of biological systems adjusted to their environment, leading to a perpetuation of genetic qualities best suited to survive in that particular environment. Random, proceeding, made or occurring without a definite aim or pattern or reason. As in a selection of random numbers. Or in statistics, a process of selection in which each item has an equal probability of occurring. Mutations, in biology, a departure from a parent type in one or more inheritable characteristics, caused by a random change in a gene or chromosome. Starting with these definitions, Marshall begins to ask questions about random mutations that are important from an information theory view. That is, considering DNA as information, we need to know how often, fast, and significant these mutations are. It turns out experiments have been done to study this phenomenon. This picture is from one of those experiments. Here is a picture of a fruit fly, which resulted when multiple generations of fruit flies were subjected to various mutagens in efforts to find beneficial mutations. Note, this was done in an attempt to speed up the number of mutations. The fruit fly shown has its front legs coming out of its eyeballs, and its shriveled rear legs are useless. This one could not reproduce. In the last section of Marshall's Chapter 4, Pity the Fruit Fly, which is about testing random mutations, Marshall brings up the fruit fly test and 10 other studies, with fast reproducing species, looking for beneficial mutations which might make the biological system under study benefit from random mutations. Marshall notes that there never were beneficial mutations created or found in these studies. The final conclusion that Marshall comes to is that mutations in the genetic code, almost universally, are deleterious to biological systems. Indeed, there are mechanisms which seek out damaged DNA in biological systems and take advantage of the redundancy of the DNA chain, allowing systems and cells to repair and rectify copying errors, which Marshall details in the book. This is Charles Darwin. Before throwing mud at the man, it behooves us to read that Perry Marshall says about him his seminal work, The Origin of Species, 1859, Darwin's theory of evolution, said simply this: small variations in organisms over vast periods of time, filtered by natural selection, defined above, were responsible for the development of new species. I will continue with Perry's assessment. Darwin himself did not promote the concept that the variations were random. Randomness in variations did not become an evolutionary dogma until the 20th century. And to understand this, we have to realize that 1. Darwin knew nothing of DNA. 2. Darwin knew nothing about the rules of genetics and inheritance of traits. The laws of heredity and genetics were discovered by this man. Mendel's experiments with traits in peas, although being performed at the time of Darwin's book, were not generally known until about 20 to 30 years after The Origin of Species. Mendel published his work in 1866, demonstrating the actions of invisible factors, now called genes, in predictably determining the traits of an organism. The profound significance of Mendel's work was not recognized until the turn of the 20th century, more than 3 decades later, with the rediscovery of his laws. The above is a reprint of his original work. Perry says, what we now have presented as Darwinism is better known as Neo-Darwinism or modern evolutionary synthesis. Really developed in the 1930s and 40s. It rejects the idea of passing on any learned traits from progenitors, including the concept of changes in first generations due to environmental responses. Neo-Darwinism explicitly, and virulently, denies any purpose, prediction, or programming, information, in evolution. It is the prevailing paradigm in science today. That brings us to Evolution 2.0, Chapter 5, Information Theory. Now to really understand how biological systems work, Perry Marshall takes us into information theory, so that we understand how information works, and how it is transmitted. Here is pure digital information. It is a picture of a set of binary data, as the basic form of computer information. Perry notes that even in the electronic realm, random bit errors ruin digital information. But to understand how DNA provides the information to build everything living, it helps us to look at a primitive model. A CNC machine tool, which can cut metal in patterns carried as information or instructions on a simple roll of paper tape, with holes punched in it. Now let's look at a CNC, computer numeric controlled, machine from the 1950s. This is called a milling machine. It can mill away metal, as on a plate, shown here, in a precise pattern, which is stored on a paper tape like this. Punch tapes as above, were fed into a reader, which would control the machining tool and move it in patterns as directed by the punched tape. Here's an example of a piece of metal being machined by a punch tape controlled machine tool. Here's an example of a piece of metal being machined by a punched tape controlled machine tool. In the 1970s, I was well aware of CNC machining, punched tapes, and the transfer of information using these methods. At the same time, I took an elective course in chemical engineering, taught from Watson's book Molecular Biology of the Gene 1970. In that 800-page book, which gave you enough molecular biology information to cause your head to explode, there was one sort of image, which Marshall has in his book, and when I saw that image it hit me like a ton of bricks. Please note the segment labeled mRNA being translated. And it is shown in the ribosome, and there is a white tRNA which brings amino acids in the cell fluid to put them in place in the ribosome according to the message, information, on the mRNA. Also note there is also another amino acid being lined up attached to a tRNA that will go in, and that will be a different amino acid, depending on the pattern in the mRNA. There are plenty of amino acids floating around in the cell. And as the mRNA is drawn into the ribosome, the corresponding tRNAs with the various amino acids are brought in and assembled into a long chain. From hundreds of amino acids to tens of thousands of amino acids. We can also do this analogy, when the section of the DNA being used is a track in the hard drive, then someone has formed the USB drive copy, and then the USB drive copy puts the program in to run the ribosome CNC machine to make the needed protein which runs every process in the cell. There are at least 20,000 different proteins made by our cells, which have been identified. This has been my explanation of why DNA is like a computer program, and by the end of chapter 7 of Marshall's book, he has explained that DNA is a computer code, or program, needed to run the cell, which is the computer. Then Perry brings us to a crucial question: are there any processes in the natural world that produce a computer code or a program? Perry asks the really important questions. 1. Do the laws of physics produce code, or information, or the word, i.e., if you provide the necessary chemicals, will they magically become information? Shake and bake. 2. Chaos theory and fractals describe systems that apparently produce regular structures out of matter, with addition of energy. But are there computer codes, or the words, coming out of these systems? 3. Do complex chemical reactions produce computer codes, or the word? 4. Have we ever found anything in nature that is like a computer code, aside from the DNA, and that has come into existence spontaneously? Do you remember the start of this talk, mentioning matter and energy, but something that we have with biological systems that does not seem to be explainable, and that is that biosystems that inherently have information in them? Perry asks the really important questions. 1. Do the laws of physics produce code, or information, or the word, i.e., if you provide the necessary chemicals, will they magically become information? Shake and bake. 2. Chaos theory and fractals describe systems that apparently produce regular structures out of matter, with addition of energy. But are there computer codes, or the words, coming out of these systems? 3. Do complex chemical reactions produce computer codes, or the word? 4. Have we ever found anything in nature that is like a computer code, aside from the DNA, and that has come into existence spontaneously? Do you remember the start of this talk, mentioning matter and energy, but something that we have with biological systems that does not seem to be explainable, and that is that biosystems that inherently have information in them? Marshall's chapter 8 is called Code, or the Word, First, and Evolution, that is, improvements and synthesis built into the biological systems to respond to the conditions they are found in, is second. Perry tells a story to illustrate that information processing systems don't happen by accident. Marshall tells of a good friend who ran into an older gentleman at a coffee shop in Portland, Oregon. The older man, 80s, came over to his friend, who was doing some work on an Apple, and the elderly gentleman asked him if he programmed or used applications. He admitted, although he's done some programming in his early years working with computers, now he was using them with applications for business work he did. In the discussion about things, the older gentleman noted the importance of trying to do things one has never done before. Marshall's friend asked in a friendly way, "Have you done that?" And the older man said, "Yes, I think I can say I've done that." Marshall's friend said, "How so?" And the man said, "I invented the first digital image scanning and retrieve system. Fortunately, someone had a smartphone and knew who Russell Kirsch was, and snapped this photo of him and Marshall's friend on that day when they met." Marshall then describes all the steps it took to develop the systems to scan images, digitize them, and then reproduce them. And then Marshall makes the point, this did not happen by accident. This chapter leads into chapter 9, Let's Make Some Noise, dispelling the concept of random mutations one and for all. A bullet point summary of the things introduced up to chapter 9 would look like this. Neo-Darwinism says random mutation plus natural selection plus time equals evolution, and new species, etc. Random mutations are noise. Noise destroys information, or in other words, random mutations equals damaged DNA. Marshall goes on to say that any randomness-based theory of evolution violates laws of information entropy. An example of this is that music doesn't get better if you scratch a record or a CD. Organisms do not gain new features when DNA mutates through damage, outside forces, or through copying errors. Instead of improving the biosystem, you get things like birth defects, cystic fibrosis, or things like a fruit fly's front legs growing out of its eye sockets. Perry Marshall's Chapter 10, How Do We Fix Evolution? Marshall writes a 4-page chapter, the intent of which is to set the stage for the next 20 chapters, which outline all the aspects which shows that what really drives the construction of new species and biological systems is the intelligence that is built into biological systems, i.e. they are designed to change in response to their environments and to build more complex systems as needed. This is somewhat bizarre, but in a nutshell, biological systems were designed with the word intelligence in them, and with the ability to redesign and improve that intelligence as they reproduce and respond. He proposes several concepts for what is shown in the last 20 chapters, and has a summary sentence. Does this mean that living things adapt because cells can and do edit their own DNA? He also says, the current explanation for evolution in living things, which is randomness, is wrong. The fruit fly mutation experiments and the problems with entropy, a thermodynamic principle, destroying information, needed for all life, and for the progression of life forms, need to be resolved. To explain this, Marshall introduces the Swiss Army knife of evolution 2.0. Above represents a model of the tools that are built into living systems, so that they can thrive and make themselves better. Now we do need to review the concepts of neo-Darwinism, which says in brief, random mutations plus natural selection plus time equals evolution of new organisms. The big problem with this concept is that mutations are noise, and noise destroys information. To help explain this concept, I'm going to list the 5 blades of the biological Swiss Army knife, according to Marshall's. Blade number 1, transposition of genes, or the 70-year-old Nobel Prize-winning discovery by Barbara McClintock, that none of the Darwinian evolutionists want to recognize. The net result is that cells rearrange their own DNA, by precise rules to make beneficial changes for following generations. Blade number 2. Horizontal gene transfer, when cells or organisms transfer genetic information between cells or entities of the same type and perhaps different types. This phenomenon was found when it was observed that elementary bacteria reacted to antibiotics with some members of a group of bacteria exposed to the antibiotic compound somehow managed to change their DNA, so as to survive the antibiotic. Then these changes in the DNA can be transferred by things called prion from immune bacteria, first generation, to other bacteria of the same type.
Blade number 3. Epigenetics. How parents pass learned traits to their children. One of the first examples found. The high-altitude gene found in folks living in the Andes above 6,000 feet. And Andes missionaries and their children acquiring the gene. This is where cells switch the sections of their DNA on and off to adapt to external influences and assure their survival in the first generation exposed to the environmental stressors, and also pass that on to the next generations. Here are some examples of epigenetics. Cell differentiation. Epigenetics helps determine which function a cell will have, such as becoming a nerve cell, muscle cell, or skin cell. For example, nerve cells and muscle cells have the same DNA. But epigenetics allows the muscle cell to turn on genes that make proteins for movement, while turning off genes that are important for a nerve cell's job. Identical twins. Identical twins share the same DNA, but their unique experiences in life cause some genes to express themselves differently, which is why they come to look and behave differently over time. Diet. A mother mouse given a diet rich in folic acid can methylate a gene that controls coat color, resulting in more brown pups being born. Stressors. Stressors can cause epigenetic changes. Environmental pollutants. Environmental pollutants can cause epigenetic changes. Toad flax, a common plant. Common toad flax and pale orice toad flax are 2 variants of the same plant with a difference in one gene. But it's not a difference in the DNA code. The difference is epigenetic. And pale orice toad flax, which is non-symmetrical, can pass on this epi mutation to its offspring. Blade number 4. Cooperation between separate organisms that connect with each other. Evolution from a cooperation between organisms. Examples given are the formation of lichens, which are a merger of a fungus and an algae. It seems that the fungal layer of a lichen can be removed and independently grown as just a fungus, and the same is true of the algae layer. Likewise, lichens have been synthesized by a German botanist, Eugen Thomas, but to get the details you have to buy the original paper in German and translate it. Blade number 5. Genome duplication. See evolution, or genetic change at lightning speed. This is difficult to explain, but we will try to simplify the concept. Sometimes, it is possible for two separate species to mate. And, not surprisingly, the result, as in the case of a horse and a donkey, the result is sterile. A mule, however, there is evidence being found now. Marshall cites studies of hagfish and sea squirts which show that a species known as the vertebrate hagfish is a combination of the two separate species, with the corresponding addition of the two genomes into a larger, new combined genome. It's not clear how many generations this took, but the evidence of the separate gene sets existing, the resulting vertebrate hagfish has been found by looking at the DNA in the sea squirt's 14 chromosomes and the hagfish 28 chromosomes. The DNA shows evidence of two different species sea squirts, and the hagfish being a merger of these two. Compared Darwinian evolution, this change was almost in one generation. This process can also be called hybridization. Above is one type of sea squirt, and here is another type of sea squirt. Each of these have 14 chromosomes. But here is a hagfish. The 28 chromosomes in this organism have been traced to these two different types of sea squirts. The mechanism of how this happened is not known. Yet the evidence is there that this is what has happened. This brings us to a new formula: adaptive mutations responding to various drivers. Many times in a first generation plus, resulting natural selection, i.e., the adaptive organism survives better than the original one plus time shorter than implied in classic evolution. Evolution 2.0. DNA is a language. In Chapter 11 of Evolution 2.0, Marshall introduces the concept of DNA being a language, and biological cells being able to speak, thus communicate and understand this language, and react to messages from the language in ways that organize changes and improvements. He brings up some important work by two researchers, one by Rutgers University Professor Sung-Chul G and another an information theorist, Hubert Yockey, both of whom identify characteristics of human language, and both show that most of the criteria for human language communication are met by the way DNA communicates in the cell, and through more than one method communicate with other cells in connected systems. He then asks the question, do cells just use the DNA to get templates? Or do they actually understand what the DNA is saying? If they understand their instructions, and like humans can edit them, or change the instructions to a superior form, we may have cracked the ultimate method of biological improvements made by cells. If cells can create new linguistic patterns based on information from outside the cells, the mystery of how directed biological improvements will be solved. As yet, it is not fully solved, only observed in action. Because of this mystery, I find that it is time to throw in my personal lecture on the origin of the universe, the galaxies, all stellar bodies, and all planets. First off, we need to point out this book. While attending Colonial Church in Edina, I was given this book by a fellow churchman, and he asked me to interpret it for him. He dealt in commercial real estate, so physics and the nature of time were not his strong points. When I got through with this book, I returned it to Scott and said, "Thank you for giving me this. I now have a better understanding of the nature of God." Scott was perplexed until I explained the story in Exodus, where Moses meets God in the burning bush. I then pointed out that Moses did a very Jewish and Middle Eastern thing. He asked God, "What is your name?" or "Who are you?" But Moses said to God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh, and bring the Israelis out of Egypt?" Because of this mystery, I find that it is time to throw in my personal lecture on the origin of the universe, the galaxies, all stellar bodies and all planets. From Exodus chapter 3, verse 11. And God said, "I will be with you, and this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain." Verse 12. Moses said to God, "Suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, 'The God of your fathers has sent me to you,' and they ask me, 'What is his name?' Then what shall I tell them?" Verse 13. God said to Moses, "I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. The I am has sent me to you." This is somewhat of an expansion. I've read that the original Hebrew just says God said, "I am." Verse 14. God also said to Moses, "Say to the Israelites, 'The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you.'" I went on to explain that this one statement clarified that God does not exist in time. I was then able, because Scott had read the book, to explain that if one supposes there is no matter in the universe before the action of the Big Bang, there would be nothing called time. I also pointed out the problem that Julian Barber had with his own theory. And that was the conclusion about asking, how long did it take the matter to distribute itself in the universe once the Big Bang occurred? And the answer to that, which makes Barber have a fit, is that in our view of time, as the matter proceeded out of the Big Bang, it all went into place instantaneously. Since I made this bold statement about 14 years ago, that all the matter in the universe was distributed in the way we think instantaneously, something has happened. We now have evidence that this instantaneous distribution is the reality of the Big Bang. Here is that evidence and where it comes from. The Webb telescope. And because of the things seen by the Webb telescope, we have this. The James Webb Space Telescope discovers enormous distant galaxies that should not exist. By Teresa Poltero, VA, published February 22, 2023. Giant, mature galaxies seem to have filled the universe shortly after the Big Bang, and astronomers are puzzled. These 6 galaxies may force astronomers to rewrite cosmology books. Image credit: NASA, ESA, CSA, Lab. Nobody expected them, they were not supposed to be there. And now, nobody can explain how they had formed.
Galaxies nearly as massive as the Milky Way and full of mature red stars seem to be dispersed in deep field images obtained by the James Webb Space Telescope, Webb or JWST, during its early observation campaign, and they are giving astronomers a headache. These galaxies, described in a new study based on Webb's first data release, are so far away that they appear only as tiny reddish dots to the powerful telescope. By analyzing the light emitted by these galaxies, astronomers established that they were viewing them in our universe's infancy only 500 to 700 million years after the Big Bang. Say what? This is what I told Scott about 14 years ago, after I had read Barber's book. This is what I call the number 1 hole in the fabric of cosmology, and the timetable of creation and our existence. There is also a number 2 hole in the fabric of cosmology, i.e., finding the Earth was formed by being spat out of the Sun. Perhaps soon after the Sun was in place and had ignited. To explain this, I have to tell about my 2005 visit to Ukraine, and a research institute called Proton 21. Below, Stanislav Adamenko, Maxim Kosub, and Lev Malowinsky, left to right, the 3 principles of Proton, about 24 researchers total.
Here is a picture of a little book by my friends in Ukraine, and below is from page 14 of the introduction to the above book, 780 pages. I think you will find a familiar name above. So why do I bring this up? I bring it up because one of the results of my friends' experiments was to create super heavy nuclei. What are they? They are atoms with more than 238 protons and neutrons in their nuclei. In fact, 240, 250, 260 all the way up to 450. The experiments consisted, thousands of them, of discharging 200,000 volts at 500,000 amps for 5 nanoseconds between two copper electrodes.
Here is an analysis of the elements found on the screen after a shot. Essentially, all the elements of the periodic table are formed by this process. And here are some mass spec results. Here is a presentation of the X-ray spectrum captured during one of the discharges of their device. It is compared to an assemblage of X-ray spectra from stellar sources. There is no way, using the fusion cycle, to generate the X-ray spectrum of the Sun. The fact that their shots are creating stellar X-ray spectra gives the implication that there are assemblages of sure heavy nuclei at the center of the Sun. There is theory around this, for neutron stars and nuclear islands of stability which can create antimatter from matter by deep potential nuclear wells formed by the super-heavy nuclei. See Walter Grainier's works. Above is some info about super-heavy nuclei and Walter Grainier.
Because of one other thing that the fusion cycle cannot do, i.e., produce an final fusion product with any atomic mass greater than that of iron, it is typically taken that because 2/3 of the elements in the periodic table in the Earth's crust are greater than iron in atomic mass, we are a captured remnant of a supernova explosion. Well, first we have the X-ray problem, then we have the fact that the planets in the solar system are all in the same plane, which lines up with the rotation of the Sun, which is observable watching sunspots. The likelihood of capturing our planets all in that one plane is essentially zero. And now we are finding more and more planets by watching the wobble of the stars and the occultation of the light from the stars, first achieved in 1996. Now up to over 5,000 planets have been found. And now we are finding more and more planets by watching the wobble of the stars and the occultation of the light from the stars, first achieved in 1996. Now up to over 5,000 planets have been found. So how does this affect cosmology? Simple. If you presume that U-238 and U-235 are formed at the same time with the supernova going off, then you take the 1/2 life of each on, ratio them, back calculate, and you get 4.3 billion years for the life of the Earth. If we were formed from the Sun, this cosmology is thrown out. Likewise, the 14 billion year age of the universe may be in error. See the results of the Webb telescope observations, and my comments on Barber, the end of time. Notice I have not said the Earth is 6,000 years old, or 60,000 years old, or whatever. I'm just saying, maybe science and scientists do not have a complete understanding of all aspects of matter, creation of the universe, nuclear physics, the structure of all matter in all forms, etc. Yet, a lot of people will flap their mouths and tell you they do have complete knowledge of these matters. I will bring this up, however. Schweitzer's dangerous discovery. When this shy paleontologist found soft, fresh-looking tissue inside a T-Rex femur, she erased a line between past and present. Then all hell broke loose. By Barry Yeoman. April 26, 2006, 7:00 p.m. May 17, 2018, 3:28 p.m. Ever since Mary Higby Schweitzer peeked inside the fractured thigh bone of a Tyrannosaurus rex, the introverted scientist's life hasn't been the same. Neither has the field of paleontology. 2 years ago, Schweitzer gazed through a microscope in her laboratory at North Carolina State University and saw lifelike tissue that had no business inhabiting a fossilized dinosaur skeleton, fibrous matrix, stretchy like a wet scab on human skin, what appeared to be supple bone cells, their three-dimensional shapes intact, and translucent blood vessels that looked as if they could have come straight from an ostrich at the zoo. By all the rules of paleontology, such traces of life should have long since drained from the bones. It's a matter of faith among scientists that soft tissue can survive at most for a few tens of thousands of years, not the 65 million since T. rex walked what's now the Hell Creek Formation in Montana. But Schweitzer tends to ignore such dogma. She just looks and wonders, pokes and prods, following her scientific curiosity. That has allowed her to see things other paleontologists have missed, and potentially to shatter fundamental assumptions about how much we can learn from the past. If biological tissue can last through the fossilization process, it could open a window through time, showing not just how extinct animals evolved but how they lived each day. Fossils have richer stories to tell about the details of dinosaur life than we have been willing to listen to, says Robert T. Backer, curator of paleontology at the Houston Museum of Natural Science. This is one spectacular proof of that. At the same time, the contents of those T. rex bones have also electrified some creationists, who interpret Schweitzer's findings as evidence that Earth is not nearly as old as scientists claim. I invite the reader to step back and contemplate the obvious, wrote Carl Wieland on the Answers in Genesis website last year. This discovery gives immensely powerful support to the proposition that dinosaur fossils are not millions of years old at all, but were mostly fossilized under catastrophic conditions a few thousand years ago at most. Rhetoric like this has put Schweitzer at the center of a raging cultural controversy, because she is not just a pioneering paleontologist but also an evangelical Christian.
What isn't mentioned in the article is the way this discovery is dangerous. Before I explain the danger, to orthodox scientific dogma, we need to discuss my background in nuclear power and radiation health physics. Nuclear plants that I have worked at as an engineer. Monticello Nuclear Power Plant, Monticello, Minnesota. Prairie Island Nuclear Power Plants, Red Wing, Minnesota. Fort Calhoun Nuclear Power Plant, north of Omaha, Nebraska. Because I worked in nuclear power for 21 years, I'm completely familiar with background ionizing radiation exposure from cosmic rays and terrestrial emitting sources, uranium, radon, thorium, cobalt, nuclear weapons, etc. It is about 300 millirem per year. Because of that background radiation in 400,000 years, you'd be exposing the DNA and other organic compounds in the T-rex bones to 120,000 Röntgen of total accumulated radiation, and its effects. Bone, a calcium, inorganic compound, and metals and stone are all pretty much immune from damage from ionizing radiation. Biosystems are not.
I'm still trying to find an image of a plant exposed to 100,000 Röntgen I saw years ago. It showed essentially a charred piece of material, as in burned to ash, therefore the T-rex is less than 350,000 year old and all the biomolecules should be gone. Turned into H2O, CO2, SO2 and water. The Geologic Age, by Strata, and a lot of assumptions about the Earth's geology and geological history, is 80 million years. That is an error in the calculations that would get any engineer fired for making, and also break any system engineered with that big of a precision error. So in conclusion, it is really hard, impossible after these facts are presented, to figure out when things started, and where everything is in the timeline of development right now. Much less to come up with the original word or templates or design, much less to derive the source of them with current thinking. Yes, there are too many unknowns. But the concept of randomness does not stand up to the scrutiny of order arrangement information in the biological world. Therefore, I say, do you want to see the image of God? Look in the mirror. Do you want to see and feel the Word? Look at your hands, your legs, your hair, your eye. You get the idea. But look at them with powerful microscopes and see the order and the elegance. This all came from the Word. From the New Testament book of John chapter 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He, the Word, was with God in the beginning. Through him, the Word, all things were made. Without him, the Word, nothing was made that has been made.